Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Heather Hansen. Heather is an author, a TEDx speaker, and a global communication specialist. Heather, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you today. Could
Thanks
you
for having me. I'm so happy to be here. It's about time
very
we
much?
did this.
Could you please just start by telling us how did you become interested in communication in the first place?
That's such a good question. And I think it goes all the way back to my childhood. I mean, I was always the talker in the family, first of all, the one who was always talking too much in class, always loved communication. And by the time I went to high school, in America, we have a very large program in speech and debate. And so I did competitive speech and debate all through high school, 4 years. I had it as a class in school, 1 hour a day. I know there's a lot of progress actually in the UK now around oration skills and things in schools. But I mean, in America, I think that the National Speech and Debate Association is celebrating 100 years next year, I believe. So this has been going on a really long time in America, and I loved it. It was my whole life, was speech and debate. And then, fast forward many years after degrees in international studies with a focus on language and society, like a sociolinguistics degree. I picked up a German degree, started some master's work in linguistics, came to Singapore eventually via Denmark. And when I got here, I found out, wait a second, I can do this for a living. Like I can get paid to talk. That's my one natural talent. I mean, how did I not know this? And so I started working as a speaker, trainer, coach, specifically in communication skills and applying all my experience and learning in linguistics and communication to the corporate arena in multinational companies here. Yeah.
It's interesting that your fascination with communication started at school and with debates and with
Mhm.
oratory. And you and I are obviously both native English speakers. You clearly
Yeah.
speak other languages too, which sadly I don't, or at least not to any high level. If we think about communicating internationally,
Mm.
English, my language, is the global language of the internet, of science, of technology,
Mhm.
often of education and research, which
Mhm.
gives me a huge advantage as a native English speaker. Are
Mhm.
native English speakers good communicators?
Hmm. Unfortunately, not. Typically, not in global environments. The reason being that, first of all, we do think it's our language and we are the best speakers of it, and we know what is right and wrong because we grew up speaking it, which those of us who do what we do know that actually the people who grew up not speaking English and learning it in a classroom, they end up learning the rules. They know the real grammar. We just learn from listening to the people around us, our parents and teachers, and we are going to mimic and parrot really anything that we hear around us. But when native speakers like us then go into a workplace in a global environment mixed with speakers from all over the world, we forget that they aren't also perfectly fluent native speakers with the same culture and background as us. We use all of our cultural expressions and idioms, our sports analogies, our slang, and we just assume that everyone's going to understand it around us, and they don't. And so we cause a lot of problems in these global settings for sure.
Is the solution to that not somehow enabling people who speak English as a second language just to improve to our level?
Yeah, that's normally the, as you know, that's normally the reaction, right? Is, well, I'm the English speaker. They need to learn English to speak like I speak. I mean, I don't have any responsibility in this interaction. I should be able to simply speak the way I always do. Why do I have to change? But it's that misunderstanding or not realizing that when you move outside of your typical place of communication, when I'm outside of America, when I'm outside of the UK, or even if I'm in it and dealing with others, there's different rules at play. Globally, the English spoken globally is very different from the native varieties that we speak. Even the varieties that you and I speak are very different in a number of ways. And we forget about that. And so when we go into an international environment, we need to learn the new rules, the new vocabulary, the new ways of interacting. at a global, multicultural, multilingual level, which is difficult for a lot of native English speakers who are monolingual. And that's usually the biggest difference I see between those who are successful communicators in global settings and those who are not. Because the monolinguals typically don't have that experience of an understanding of what it's like to learn another language or communicate in another language. So they don't have that same own experience to know what others are going through. And so that empathy is difficult to have when you don't truly understand what that's like.
And you yourself have firsthand lived experience of living, working, studying in a second
Yeah.
language. Simple question. What is it like?
No, it's hard. It is so hard. It's tiring. It's exhausting. With a lot of time and many years, it gets easier and easier and easier the more fluent you become. But I can remember when I was living in Austria, I did a semester abroad in Austria. All of my courses were in German. Sometimes the professors had to make accommodations for me to speak High German and not dialect, because, of course, I couldn't understand dialect. And that was never a good thing when they had to speak High German and they didn't want to. But all my homework, all my papers, everything. And it took me, I was used to just acing my classes. It was no big deal, so easy. And, I could cram for a test. I could write an essay in a week. I could do all those things. But suddenly when it's in another language, it's a completely different level. Then I moved to Denmark. I now speak Danish fluently. My husband's Danish. We speak Danish and English at home with the kids. And then I was in more of a working environment. And that as well, it's just very draining and tiring. I worked 2 summers in Switzerland as well, also German speaking environments. And it's this mental load that is always there, translating. Oh, did I get that? What was that word? Did I miss something? It takes an extreme amount of focus to do that. And even now, when I'm pretty fluent in Danish, it's still tiring in the beginning. If I'm back in Denmark and I haven't been speaking Danish all the time, it's like, oh, where are my words? And I'm grasping for things, and I might miss something or mumbled articulation, something that isn't very clear. So yeah, it's a whole different level of intensity and exhaustion when you're always dealing in another language.
It does sound very intense, and a number of people have said to me it's so tiring to operate in a second language. I remember one of my clients is actually American but works in Spain, and he was giving a lift home to an Italian colleague after a day-long meeting, which had been conducted in English. It was an international company. So you got, I think, the American, the Italian in Spain, and they're all speaking English. And it was a very, very long day, quite intense, probably rather boring. And the American said to the Italian guy, "That was exhausting. I'm glad that's over. It's time for a beer." And the Italian guy looked around and said, "Yeah, try doing all that in your third language."
Yeah.
And I think that's something we
Yeah.
just really don't appreciate, the extra effort
Mm-hmm.
involved, how draining it can be. And then
Yeah.
to go and have to make small talk in the
Exactly.
breaks as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And
There's
to
no turning off your brain. You're just on. And then after, yeah, the American wants to, oh, let's go for a drink. I'm ready to wind down. And they're like, I don't even want to talk anymore. I don't want to have to process. Now we have to go to a loud bar or restaurant, and I have to keep focusing with all this external noise. And it's really tough. So it impacts a lot of areas you don't think about: the social life, the interactions, the networking, because it's that much harder on top of just the normal workload that you're trying to process to then manage the relationships and the social situations. It's really difficult.
and is
Yeah.
that something in your work with organizations that you have to try and address? Because I can understand when we're looking at communication in an organization, a company, a university, or whatever, we might focus on what I would call the set pieces. So in a
Mhm.
university, it might be the lectures. In a business, it might be how to do a sales call, non-native
Mhm.
speaker to
Mhm.
native speaker or vice versa. But
Mhm.
do you also have to look at things on this wider level of
Mhm.
organizational culture and the small talk and the
Mhm.
networking, the water cooler moments. Is that important to
Yeah.
focus on too in the
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because, of course, from the company perspective, the HR perspective, they want me to work with that individual on, perfecting their presentation skills and helping them with those sales calls and participating in meetings and all of those things. But when I get one-on-one with the individual, it is usually, oh, but how do I manage the small talk? Or how do I give feedback to my colleague, which is a little bit more informal. It's general conversational skills. It's how do I process what I'm hearing faster, and it could be native or non-native. It that doesn't matter so much, but just in general. And I find that because the people that I'm working with are at a very high leadership level, and so for them, it's those informal associations, the networking and the social arena that becomes even more important for them as they move higher and higher in the organization. So it definitely is a huge part of my work and in helping to gain the confidence in those kinds of settings, because it can truly hold people back if they aren't managing that well. And those are some of the hardest situations to manage, especially if it's a mixed setting, because one, we have all of that extra noise. And two, we have a lot more slang, informal speech, mumbling, not fully articulated. It's just much more difficult to understand in social settings. It moves a lot faster. We speak a lot faster, and we drop that formal business persona that we might have had an hour ago in the office when we shift over, and then add alcohol in the mix if that's part of it, and it just gets worse and worse. Although for many non-native speakers, myself included, my language skills get better and better as I'm drinking. So you never know; it goes both ways.
I mean, we're talking about different aspects of communication and in different settings, formal, informal, and at different levels in an organization. But I think what you said there was really interesting, that it seems to me a lot of organizations focus on culture. A lot of organizations focus on EDI or DEI, diversity and inclusion. But language, to me, seems to be the basis of all of that.
Yeah.
Getting communication right, or making communication possible, seems to
Yeah.
be the foundation for
Mhm.
DEI inclusion,
I
cultural
absolutely
understanding.
agree. Absolutely agree. It starts with the language. And ironically, when we look at DEI policies in the workplace, none of them include language. When we look at the laws in place in different countries, they do not protect language and accent. And this, I think, is a really big problem. So if you have an accent issue at work and someone is very biased against the way that you speak in your particular accent, you have to actually prove that it's not accent bias at play, but that it is your national identity or your race or some kind of gender discrimination in order to be legally protected. So there's been a number of cases. The most recent one I heard that was quite shocking was a Filipino English teacher on a military base in Korea, an American military base, and teaching the children of the military. And this teacher was fired because the parents were up in arms about their children learning English from a Filipino. Now, it's likely he is as native as you and I, but has a slightly different accent, probably leaning more towards mine than yours. And yet it wasn't good enough for these families. So he was fired from that role, took his case to the courts, and the American Justice Department threw out the case because they said this had nothing to do with national identity. It wasn't discriminating against you as a Filipino. It was because you did not have English, the right kind of English to be an English teacher. If you had been a math teacher, it wouldn't have been a problem. And that, I think, is a really tough situation, right? Yeah, it just isn't right. He's not protected. He speaks English as well as all of us. I mean, I don't know the details. I haven't heard this person speak. Maybe the grammar was all off, everything else, but the case was being made that it was purely accent related. And there is no protection for that.
Yeah, it's generally not a protected characteristic in law, as you say, and yet
Yeah,
we judge people on accent all the time.
all the
It's
time.
potentially positive, potentially negative in how we do it, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a real
Mm-hmm.
thing. And this is something that interests me because I think it's possible, obviously, to learn vocabulary. It's possible to learn grammar. It's possible to learn spelling if you're doing the writing side of things. But it's really hard to learn an accent. And yet, as you say, it's one of the fundamental things we're judged upon very, very quickly when we speak. You mentioned varieties of English and different kinds of standards of English, and why native speakers can sometimes cause problems in the way they communicate. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that? What kind of issues on a language level might, or in your experience, do native speakers cause when they're communicating internationally?
Yeah, so they generally fall into the same category. It's things like speaking way too quickly, mumbling, not really articulating our sounds. It's funny because I've been abroad now 22 years, 22 years. And when I go back to California, people say I talk funny. And I'm not exactly sure what it is I'm doing. I think it's because I'm very careful with my T sound, for example, whereas although I'm sure in conversation with you, I wouldn't do it. But when I'm on a large global webinar, for example, I'm being careful to say international instead of international, and internet instead of internet, and my T endings on words and things like that. And so when people say I talk funny, I say, what, you mean clearly? Like I just try to speak clearly, because being abroad so long, you naturally, without thinking, start to make a lot of changes to how you speak. If you're aware of the environment and you've had enough misunderstandings, you start to realize what needs to be changed, and you subconsciously do it. You don't even need to be focused on it for most, but there are exceptions to that rule. So speaking too fast, mumbling, and just simply not articulating well, adding in too many idioms, cultural expressions, sports terminology and sports terms, even among all of the different native varieties of English spoken in Singapore, we don't even understand each other. You know, we have somebody say some example of something related to cricket, and I have no idea what we're talking about. Or somebody says something about, rugby from Australia, or even Australian football. I don't know the difference. And then, you even say the word football and we don't know if we're talking soccer or we're talking American football or Australian versions or rugby. We don't even know what sports we're talking about. So when you bring in analogies and things like that, and we don't realize how many of them come from sports. I mean, even touch base comes from American baseball. There's so many that come from sports that are just so ingrained in us that we don't even realize when it comes out of our mouth that, oh, wait, someone might not understand that, because we don't even know that it comes from the sport. One I use a lot, and I'm always catching myself saying, is like the whole 9 yards. Well, and actually, I think somebody told me it wasn't necessarily from American football, although that's the way I always think of it in my mind. I heard that it could have something to do with weapons, with like rifles, and something about the bullets and how they were fed into the guns. It was something really awful. So now I've really tried to stop saying it. But I mean, you can see we don't even know where they come from. We make assumptions and we just use them. So that's a really difficult one. On top of that, we have all of the hierarchical and power plays that happen with the English language. And these are very much unseen. I mean, I know you were asking more for specific language things, but this side, I think, can be even more difficult to identify and address. So someone who's in the meeting and is having a bad day, is frustrated, and is just tired of misunderstandings and miscommunication, and just kind of bulldozes through the meeting, dominating it, speaking however they like without thinking, and then everybody understand, fine, go. And there are ways that I've seen native speakers use language in that way to maintain control and power, or to make others feel smaller or less than. They may not be fully aware that they're doing it, but it's exactly that they're doing. Leaving everyone feeling like, oh, I'm not good enough, or I can't compete, or I can't participate, because the boss is, not going to like what I have to say or the way that I say it, which leads to further miscommunication because they're intimidated. So also correcting people's speech. for them or thinking that they know all the answers. And this, I've seen it a million times where an American is correcting perfectly correct British English or vice versa, where it's like, these are every single variety is equal. I don't care if it's Singapore English and Filipino English and American English and British English. These Englishes are all on the same level. They all have their own rules. They all have their own grammar structures and vocabularies. So to honor one over another is not right. Yet we think because we're from the white Western, typically seen as old varieties of English, that we somehow have some kind of power or control over people who speak differently. And that's simply not the case. But that's where I think the education comes in the most, is in helping people to understand that.
And there's quite a, excuse me, my voice is going, that's coffee. There's a growing movement, certainly in the UK and also in the USA, I believe, within higher education to decolonize the curriculum. So not to perpetuate this idea of a white Western hegemony upon thought. And that can be philosophical in thinking, it can be scientific investigation, it can be language. And part of that is an awareness that the way that we typically speak or write in our culture is not the only way, and certainly is not the only legitimate way of doing it. It has its place, but it's not the only way. I think there is slow growing awareness about those things that you mentioned. Power play is really interesting. I'd like to come back to that in a moment. There's a lot in what you said. You also gave some very, very specific problems related to the way that native speakers might communicate problematically. And you mentioned speaking too quickly. I'd just like to return to that for a moment. It may sound like a really silly question, but I'm not sure it is. Why is it important to slow down when you're speaking with an international audience for whom English is a second language? Why is it important to slow down?
Because usually there's extra processing happening. So when I was in class in Austria or working in Switzerland or working in Denmark and using foreign languages, especially in the beginning, before I felt fully confident and fluent, and even now at times, if there's a word that is slightly off and I think, what was that word? We're doing extra thinking. We're translating back to our native languages. And that's what our listeners are doing, is they're actually taking a moment. It has to land. They have to digest it, get the meaning from it. And it may include translation. It may not, but it's still going to take just an extra few milliseconds, perhaps, to process that and grab it. And if, for example, for me, if I get stuck on a word and I'm trying to figure out that word, but they've already moved on 2-3 more sentences, I've missed a huge chunk of what they were trying to say to me. And I'm still stuck back 2 sentences ago, trying to figure out what that one word was or what that weird idiom was that I had never heard before. And what could it mean? And do I have one in my language that's like that? I mean, all of this is happening in my head as I'm trying to listen and process a message. So depending on what was said and how convoluted it was and how many cultural markers were involved with it, it could take me a long time to figure out exactly what the meaning was. And in a work situation, what makes it even worse is that people are embarrassed to speak up. We're even embarrassed to speak up in a classroom, in a language classroom as adults learning a language. We don't want to speak up and be like, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Can you repeat it? Or what did you say? What does that mean? And we certainly don't want to do it in an office. We don't want to do it with our boss in the room. We don't want to do it with the colleagues that we're competing over the next promotion or the international posting. And we have to prove that our English is good enough to get that next level job. And so we just nod our heads and smile and say, okay, yeah, I understood. And then try to figure it out later or find someone else. And so, this is going way beyond your question, but the need to slow it down and give space for comprehension and understanding is imperative. And I mean, I myself am very guilty of it. I fall into it because we're talking one-on-one here, forgetting that there's actually a larger global audience that will listen. And I'm probably speaking way too fast. But luckily on, podcasts, they can change that speed and put me on like 0.5.
Recorded meetings, recorded lectures are great for that reason. It's just not possible in real life, in real time.
Yeah.
So slowing down enables people the time that they need to process the language And if
Hmm.
there is difficult vocabulary, to think about it, perhaps infer the meaning from context, perhaps
Hmm.
translate. And all of
Hmm.
this just requires extra time.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah.
why slowing down is really important when you're
Absolutely.
communicating with an international audience.
Hmm.
It's, to my mind, not counterintuitive. I don't think that's the right word, but perhaps it's culturally difficult to do,
Mm.
because the only times I slow down are when I am in a position of power
Mhm.
and I'm talking down to you. That may not be in a patronizing way, but if we take one model of education, I am the teacher with the knowledge and I'm imparting it to you. Or if we're a little more inclusive, I am creating a learning
Mhm.
experience with you, but I am setting it up. I have some power there, some status, some authority.
Mhm.
And in a sense, you're almost beneath me. Even though I'm trying to look at you as equals, I'm still at least in control. Maybe that's a better word.
Mhm. Mhm.
So for me to slow down then, that feels okay.
Mhm.
I also slow down when I'm telling the children what they have done wrong and why, if they don't put
So
it right,
true.
you will be
Yeah.
going to bed early. Do you understand? That's
Mm-hmm.
okay. But to slow down
Yeah.
generally when I'm perhaps in an informal setting with
Mm.
a senior business executive who speaks English as a second language, a visiting professor who's a highly qualified specialist in their discipline, but speaks English as a second language. For me, as a native speaker from my culture, slowing down then seems patronizing.
Mm.
I
Mm.
think that's a block. What, you may have answered the question, but what would you say to that? How can I
Mm.
overcome that insecurity, if you want? I don't want to seem patronizing, so how can I slow down then? How can I get
Yeah.
over myself, to use a phrase already?
That's yeah, that's a really, really good question. And that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because I think you're right that when we speak really slow, it does feel like we're being patronizing or mocking, perhaps, or yeah, being an authoritarian figure. There is a lot of cultural baggage that comes with it. I think with time, you sort of just get used to that slower pace. It certainly doesn't sound like that. I mean, even when you're kind of purposely, and I can notice, that you've slowed down slightly, even in your explanation of that, it doesn't feel like you're being the teacher to me, or something like that. I think a lot of that is really in our heads about, oh, this means something because it means that in your particular culture and context. But I think it's again about remembering when you move out of that very specific cultural context, the rules are different again. And it doesn't mean the same thing when you move into that context. And that's, I think, what we really have to remember. But that's a really interesting idea that you're talking about, that, yeah, culturally, we feel strange. I think, too, if I'm going to be in a meeting and I'm speaking very slowly with other colleagues and peers, I feel like they might think I don't know what I'm talking about, because one of the leadership markers that we look at for a powerful, successful leader is this sense of eloquence and a bit of speed in their speaking pace. That the people who really know what they're talking about and they have power and they're in control, they can talk really eloquently, really quickly, and they know what they're talking about. Whereas people who take it slow and steady can be perceived in certain situations as not being as powerful, or as knowledgeable or as credible. So there is a lot around our leadership markers and how we define, which is all so unconscious. We don't even think about it. But again, it goes back to context, because like you said, speaking slowly could be really powerful. But then in other situations, in other contexts, when we speak quickly, it's more powerful. So it's releasing all of these cultural ideas that we have, that we've been raised with, that we've internalized, that we don't even know we're thinking about, and being able to meet people where they are and focus on intelligibility and understanding over everything else. So, and that can be very hard for especially people who like to be the grammar police or native speakers who think it's their language and others should meet them instead of meeting in the middle. That can be really tough.
It's interesting what you say, because I think a lot of it comes back to empathy. So what am I
It
trying to
really
achieve, which
does.
is communication, and there's a bit more to that.
Mhm.
What am I trying to communicate and why? But also the
Mhm.
context and the empathy. What do other people need from me for me to
Mhm.
get my message across? And that, in this context,
That's
would
right.
lead to slowing down.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really
Mhm.
very interesting what you say there. And you also mentioned idioms and
Mhm.
slang, so the whole 9 yards, which is one that you've sworn
Yeah.
you're never going
Oh,
to
my
use again
notes.
because it's not just sports, it's guns as well. It's
Yeah, it's
interesting. I
horrible. It's
was
a bad
doing
one.
a little seminar with a group of students at a school in Tennessee the other day. So all native English speakers, it's their first language, as it is mine. They're American, I'm British. And just for a little game, I put up a list of English sporting idioms. And so what do they mean? And there were about 10 of
Uh-huh.
them. I think they guessed three.
Mm.
The other seven had no idea. And then I asked
Wow.
them to give me some American idioms and said, test me. I'm not
Mhm.
the teacher now, I'm the student. But do you test me? See how much English I know? And I couldn't get those either. And as you were pointing out, as native speakers, we have these varieties of English, which are
Mhm.
not always compatible. We don't always
Exactly.
understand. When you take that globally to
Mm.
Singapore, to China, to European countries, there's almost no hope of understanding if we're using
Mhm.
idioms all the time. And when we're thinking about groups, in group, out group, and
Mhm.
groups of English speakers, on a global scale, given that English is a lingua franca, so it is the global language of so many sectors and
Mhm.
industries and um, educational forces, where do native speakers fit as a group?
Hmm. It's a group. Well, I mean, they're a huge, huge, huge minority. I can tell you that much. They're outnumbered at least four, if not five times by learners of English all over the world. And I think that's probably the most shocking statistic that every person who is born into English needs to understand. We are the minority, yet we hold all the power and privilege when it comes to language and global business in general. We have a massive, massive advantage and you know, step above everyone because we so naturally can use the language and succeed in the language. Um, from an international business perspective, this is definitely seen quite clearly out here in Southeast Asia. Still to this day, much of the high level multinational positions are filled by expats, by Westerners. Many of them are native English speakers. I usually know when someone is sent to me and what the demands are of, well, my boss says that it's hard to understand me, or my boss says I have bad English, or my boss says, and then I'll always have to be like, well, where's your boss from? Like, where exactly is that boss from? Because I understand you just fine and you sound pretty good to me. And so a lot of what I do is trying to pacify bosses from certain parts of the world who naturally speak English very, very well and have certain expectations of how their team should speak. And that isn't really fair. So we need to understand the huge advantages that we have. We also tend to be in a very small scale study I did with a network analysis company in Denmark last year, the year before. We found that people who had higher confidence in their language abilities in English were better networked throughout the company. So they had more influence in the company itself globally because their language skills were there. So of course the native speakers have the most confidence and enter those conversations and build those networks. And so there are hidden ways that we as native speakers are dominating these global conversations in a lot of ways. And I think that's also why the decolonizing concept is coming up quite a lot as well, to make space and make room for new voices and new ideas and new perspectives, especially in education.
I mean, that's interesting because we're discussing the power and the privilege of native speakers, which arises from the fact that we can use the language successfully. And there are caveats to that because we can't always.
Yeah, we
You're
cause a
talking
lot of
about
problems, but we think we still are doing really
we think
well.
we can use it
Yeah,
successfully.
and
Yeah.
others think are have an inferiority complex, right? Other people then look at us and, well, we are the good speakers, so there must be something wrong with me, and they're right. I don't speak well enough, and my English is bad, and it's this ongoing inferiority complex due to colonization, continued imperialism. It goes on and on.
Mm.
Yeah. And then you get a boss who perfectly fits that. And it's like, oh gosh, I'll never be as good as this boss in speaking English. Yeah. So it's hard.
There's a danger, it seems, in thinking this way, that we're capable, successful, and good communicators, and we have power and influence at C-suite level, which is what you've been describing. This is us as native speakers, but we are potentially in danger of ignoring the power of the wider market. By which I mean that, yes, we may well be able to create these power structures at the top, at C-suite level, but if the mass market of non-native English speakers do not understand us, we can't communicate with them, then we are missing a huge opportunity there to be successful in sales, perhaps to be successful in
Absolutely.
selling educational products or whatever. And in a way, all this stuff about it's the right thing to do, we should be inclusive, and that's the way things should be, and we ought to decolonize and potentially apologize for our past, that's fine. But the bottom line is we need to communicate better to be successful in large markets. And that's taking away all of the nice political stuff that we talk about, and I think we probably agree with. The bottom line is communicate better to make more money.
Yeah, it is the bottom line. That is the bottom line. And that's what business is about, right?
Yeah.
And the tide is, to use a nice idiom, the tide is changing. Times are changing. And we're seeing a massive shift in the way leadership is approached. And we want more human leaders. We want more vulnerability. We want more openness. It's no longer this command and control type of leadership that is working, and that's not going to work anymore. And we're seeing all of this change, since pandemic and to now. It's hugely changed. The expectations have shifted, and what we need for C-suite leaders is completely different than what it was even 10 years ago. So we're seeing a massive shift in this, and a lot of people are sort of being taken off of their pedestals to even in this communicative way, and needing to learn how to communicate at a more human level, at a more inclusive level. And these are just good communication practices, like you say. It's just being a good communicator. It doesn't matter if you grew up speaking English or not. It's just good communication, and that's the focus that we have to look at now, for sure.
One of the things that always interests me is I actually believe, perhaps naively, but I believe that most native English speakers communicating with an international audience, I think they just want to do a good job most of the time. Take out the power plays we've mentioned, but most people want to be good communicators. But it seems to me that the problem of a failure to communicate is underreported. So I might go into a meeting and deliver a presentation or deliver a lecture to international students. They actually don't really understand, but none of them tell
None
me.
of them will tell you.
Why?
I know.
Why don't
Yeah,
they?
well, again, because that's saying, it's admitting that you're not good enough. I'm the one that has the problem. It's taking on that role of inferiority of, well, they're the perfect speaker, and I'm the one who doesn't understand, and I should understand. If I tell the professor that I don't understand, well, I had to take that English test to get into the school. I told them I could speak English, and now I have to go up there and say I didn't understand what that meant. And it's a personal thing to have to admit that. So whether it's in a school setting or a workplace, having to speak up and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. We take it as it's being personal, and it's kind of making open to everyone that my English isn't as good as I said it was. Which is never the case, because even if we were having a conversation, there could be easily times when I'm like, wait, sorry, what? I didn't understand that. Say that again. Or what does that idiom mean? What are you talking about? But I would never think of that as an assault on my intelligence. But for someone who is learning the language, the first thing they go to is they're going to think I'm dumb, right? I don't want to be embarrassed. I should really know this. Why don't I know this? Let me go look it up on Google. Let me search it in the meeting. Let me ask my colleague afterwards to translate everything that was just said. So of course, yeah, it goes unreported. The people who are the worst communicators don't realize they're bad communicators because no one's telling them. They don't even really know. So even with the best intentions, if you haven't sort of been made aware is more like it, of these new rules in these international settings, then it's very easy to not follow them and break them in some way without knowing it.
So it partly comes down to a term I think originally comes from Senda Dovchin, if I remember rightly, who's an Australian academic, or an academic working in Australia. And she calls the issue linguistic inferiority complex, which is where you actually speak pretty good English, but it's different to the mainstream English of the culture around you. So you come from, let's say, Singapore, where English is clearly an official language. You come and study in the UK, but your language is different to mainstream UK English, and you feel inferior as a result. So that's one reason why people don't speak up. And of course, as you were touching upon, alluding to earlier, the power distance. There's a lot of interplay between English language and power and culture. And so to actually put your hand up in a meeting or a lecture and say, I don't understand because your English isn't good enough and you haven't explained it properly, that's a massive task, which is impossible.
Really, really difficult
to do. One of your latest books, Unmuted, looks at a lot of these issues, including speaking up. Can you just tell us, first of all, a little bit about Unmuted? What inspired you to write it, and what's your main message?
Yeah, well, the inspiration came from us going into the pandemic. I mean, obviously, the title Unmuted came from all of those Zoom calls where the first thing anybody said when you were on it was, oh, you're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute. But then I had this realization that, long before all of our Zoom meetings, there were a lot of people who had always been on mute. It's just that when we went into these Zoom settings and video call settings, it became really obvious who those people were, that they were on mute the whole meeting. Were they even there? We didn't hear anything from them. Well, before, they sat in the meeting right in front of you and didn't say a word, and you just never noticed. And so that was where Unmuted came from. It was about, how do we start bringing every voice to the table and making sure that we're getting all the best ideas out there, that we're listening to everyone, that we have really, truly inclusive communicating teams, because we know that's going to be more efficient. We know it will lead to higher profits, as well as just more inclusion and belonging in the team. So it also came from kind of a frustration as a training provider of getting calls from HR at the end of every year, like, we need a presentation skills course, tick, and we need a negotiation, and we need sales, and we need email writing, and can you come in and do a one-day course? and then thinking that everything's going to be fixed, like I come in with my magic wand and poof, we're just all happy, perfect communicators. It's not how it works, obviously. So I came up with a framework around conscious, confident, and connected communication. And this is a Venn diagram. And my argument is we need this in equal measures in order to be unmuted, fully unmuted. And what's more interesting than the conscious, confident, and connected bubbles are those overlaps. So someone who's very connected, feels like they belong in the team, very, just feels that they belong, very psychologically safe. And then they're also extremely confident, but they aren't very conscious. They forget their listening skills, they forget cross-cultural intelligence, all of these things. They tend to be too loud. So they're the people who are really loud in the meeting, dominant, talk over people, interrupt, don't listen. Then we have the people who are connected and conscious, but lack confidence, self-confidence, skills confidence. That's that little piece of the pie that's some training programs. Those people are too soft. They've turned their voices down. And then the people who are not connected, but they're very confident, they're very conscious. They've probably spoken up a million times and had all their ideas shot down by those loud voices. And they don't feel like they belong for whatever reason. It could be any of those elements of diversity and characteristics of diversity and inclusion that they somehow don't belong. They're going to eventually just press the mute button and say, you know what, I'm done. I'm disengaging. And this is what we saw throughout the pandemic, people leaving their work, leaving their jobs, and especially as we went back in, massive restructuring and reorganization of companies because people realized, you know what, I don't want to be a part of this and I don't feel like I'm a part of it. And why am I doing this? So I think when we look at communication, we have to look at it so much more holistically than simply, oh, let's improve our presentation skills and now all our problems are solved. No, that's not it. That's not going to cut it. We really need to be looking at it as a larger, more holistic, foundational element of our entire business. Like you said before, the foundation of diversity and inclusion, the foundation of all of the processes that are happening come down to the language and the communication skills of our people. And we've really just ignored it far too long. And now I think it's becoming a much more talked about area ever since the pandemic, when we went online and nobody knew how to talk to each other anymore. And it was like, what do we do? and we didn't know how to be human anymore. And since then, there's just been, I've noticed in my own business anyway, a massive upswing in the amount of inquiries and people needing more help with communication. Yeah.
Really interesting. You're saying that the foundations of good communication within an organization are to be conscious, to be confident, to be connected. And you mentioned this phrase, psychological safe space. Mm-hmm. I know we're coming to the end, but could you just briefly explain what you mean by a psychological safe space and how we can create it as well?
Yeah. I mean, psychological safety is a massive, huge topic. Anything written by Amy Edmondson, she's the one who coined that term in her original dissertation, her PhD work. And it's really referring to that we feel like we can speak up without any kind of negative repercussions, that we aren't going to lose a promotion or we aren't going to be fired, or because we call out something perhaps that shouldn't be happening, or we speak up and say, I don't think that was a nice thing to say, or I don't think we should be doing it this way. So feeling that you're in a psychologically safe environment means that you can truly be yourself, bring your full self to work, for whatever that might mean for that individual, but also speak up about when you see something you feel is unfair or something that is dangerous. I mean, psychological safety is incredibly important in factories and construction sites and places where, physical safety, health and safety is an issue, and in hospitals and among doctors and surgeons and in operating rooms, and having that psychological safety, being able to tell the top surgeon of the entire country in the middle of an operation that he's about to do something incorrectly. That needs to be there. You have to be able to do that. And that's really at the heart of being unmuted as well. So how do we create it? That's the huge question that I think we're all trying to solve, right? But I think there's a lot that we can do by starting with language and communication, starting there in the words that we use, the way that we communicate, the way we include others, the way that we listen, because we need to know when to press mute as well. So how we're listening to others and new voices and new ideas. And making people feel that they belong. And I think that does start with the language and the communication and the culture of an organization, of a society, of a community, of a family, because we can have psychological safety in a family as well. Do the children feel that they can be open and speak to their parents about tough topics? And so we can all try to create psychological safety starting in our own homes. and apply those same types of ideas to our work environment, to our friendship, to many other aspects of our lives.
What you're saying about this, I see so much in work that we do in aviation in particular, where your safe
Yeah,
voice is
exactly.
really, really important.
So
Also,
important.
with companies, with universities, actually, when you're trying to get a group of mixed students to
Mhm.
communicate in a seminar or a workshop, and you want everyone to feel safe to
Right.
contribute. Just on that, and as a final question, because I'm conscious of your time, if I am a university lecturer,
Mhm.
I'm running a seminar, I've got a mixed group of students from the UK and a number of other countries, some of them speak English as their second language. How can I start that seminar in a
Mhm.
way which enables everyone to feel included and enables everyone to understand me and speak up themselves?
Mhm.
What could I actually
Mhm.
do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different ways that you could create that environment, by and it could be very explicit in saying, making it clear that if you don't understand anything, please let me know. I'm doing my best. I know that we have multiple languages and cultures here, and I want to make sure that you're following and understand. And I might speak too fast, or I might slip and say something that you would never understand, and just point it out to me. We can do that. I think that's a good start, but also doing things to include the participants a lot more than maybe people typically do. Always allowing people to speak in their own small groups before being forced to say something to the entire room is incredibly helpful for people who have less confidence in the language itself. It helps them to be able to talk about it in a small group, get all the vocabulary, the words right, so that they know what they want to say before they're put on the spot. And putting people on the spot is going to be a big no-no, because they might know the answer, but they get so anxious in that moment of being asked that they can't get it out. So there's just so many little things that you could be doing to help them to participate more and to feel more relaxed. And it could also just be kind of laughing at yourself and the jokes that you make being a little more informal, and finding ways to connect, asking for their input. And when you ask them something, maybe asking about what would this be like from your experience in your culture or in your language. Let them speak about themselves, because we're always a little more confident. We know more about ourselves. And so there are many, many things we can do, but allowing for a lot more group work and group activities and smaller or partner discussions before forcing people to speak up is important. Also, making it clear around what language means to you in a grading situation. I know a lot of international students, especially now that I've gone back to do my own PhD. I'm in classes, very mixed group classes, and with people who do not have English as their first language, and watch them struggle with that and the vocabulary. And they are concerned, am I going to be marked down because when I present, the English isn't perfect? Or am I going to be marked down if there are grammatical errors in my papers? Do I need to have ChatGPT correcting all of the errors? Do I need to hire a proofreader? And many of them do have extra expenses to hire proofreaders or editors for their work. And so if you are in a position where you can say, and this is going to be individual to every professor and every university according to their rules, but if you're in a position to say, as long as I understand what you're trying to tell me, that's good enough for me. That is going to create a lot more psychological safety as well. That you're focused on the intelligibility and understanding, and wanting to understand what they understand more than wanting to know how good their English is from a good perspective, meaning test passing perspective. The grammar and so on. And that's going to differ across subjects and fields and universities and everything else. So that won't go for everyone, but that would also create a lot of or perhaps just saying, when you do an oral presentation, I'm not even looking at your language. I just want to know what's in your mind. You express it however you can. And that would be helpful. I think back to my own German presentations. Oh my gosh, I've never been so scared and anxious in my life. I was actually physically ill. I mean, I wasn't sleeping for 2 weeks before I had to do an oral exam in front of my whole class. And it was so, so difficult. it was so difficult. So having empathy for that. And if someone had said to me, don't worry about the language, Heather, like it's okay. I think it might have helped somewhat. I would have still had high standards for myself and want to present well. But knowing that my grade wasn't dependent on it may have helped. Yeah.
Heather, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. And let me know whenever you'd like to do this again. I think it's fabulous. I love talking with people like you who also have such a deep passion for what we do. So thanks a lot for this great conversation.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care.